Part 42. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wu Nian. Chapter 411. When Betty heard this, she looked at Liz with her big eyes and said, "Of course, otherwise how could he say that I am his lover?" Betty smiled. She jumped down from Chen Tao's arms, landed on the ground, her arms around her chest, looking at Liz. Liz walked over and looked at Betty. Her little face was full of curiosity, and she said, "But my father said that you can only get married when you grow up. You seem to be younger than me." Betty puffed up her cheeks and said, "I'm not younger than you, I'm older than your father." Liz blinked her big eyes, looked at Betty and said, "But you look younger than me." As she said that, Liz stood in front of Betty and compared her height with Betty's with her little hand. This comparison, it is true that Liz is petite, but taller, half a head taller than the petite and cute Betty. Betty was startled. She quickly took a step back and kept a distance from Liz, as if she was afraid of being exposed. She puffed her cheeks, stared at Liz, and said, "Don't compare, you are taller than me, so what? Age is not determined by height." She seemed a little angry, but with Betty's unique lowly voice, she didn't threaten at all when she spoke, but made people feel that she was even more lovely. Liz blinked and said, "But, you will grow taller when you are older." When Betty heard this, she frowned and was about to explain to Liz. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay." He stretched out his hand and picked Betty up again. He held the petite Betty in his arms and let her sit in his arms. As soon as she was in his arms, Chen Tao could smell Betty's unique hair fragrance and feel her smallness. Holding her was like holding a cloud, very light. Betty sat in Chen Tao's arms and she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't be angry with the little girl. You are a mother now." Betty puffed up her face and said, "I don't care about that." Chen Tao smiled, raised his right hand lovingly, and scratched her little nose. Betty frowned cutely because of Chen Tao's action, and hid her little face in Chen Tao's arms. "Don't make trouble, there are so many people watching." Her face was flushed. It turned out that she would be shy. Chen Tao smiled. He looked at Ritate. Ritate looked at Chen Tao and smiled and said, "Please feel free. We are going to cook the wild wolf and prepare dinner next." Chen Tao hummed and said, "You are free to do as you please. Don't think too much about us." Ritate went into the house by himself, then took out the knife and began to dissect the wild wolf by himself. Betty sat on Chen Tao's elbow by herself, half of her body nestled in Chen Tao's arms. She looked comfortable and looked over here. Chen Tao also watched the scene with interest. It was quite interesting to watch people in this cold weapon era cook food. Ritate's knife skills were good. It didn't take long for Ritate to dissect a wild wolf. Wolf skin, internal organs, and meat, separated. Afterwards, Ritate made a grill, put the wild wolf on the grill, and slowly grilled it. Chen Tao and Betty also found a chair and sat down. Betty sat in Chen Tao's arms naturally. Chen Tao hugged her gently and looked at the bonfire rising over there. It was night now. There were 2 moons and stars in the sky. The civilization of this planet had no light pollution, so the starry sky was beautiful. The light was also bright. The silver moonlight was pure and bright. Under the moonlight, everything around could be seen clearly. Chen Tao looked at Betty in his arms. Betty's beautiful little face was shrouded in moonlight, adding a bit of exquisiteness to her already beautiful face. Suddenly a gust of wind blew over. Betty frowned cutely, and she slowly hid her body in Chen Tao's arms. Seeing Betty's reaction, Chen Tao gently hugged her and stroked her arm, trying to give her some warmth. He said softly, "Are you cold?" Betty hummed, "A little cold." Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyes were more gentle. Betty is now a 5th-generation gene body. She can completely be immune to cold and heat, but in order to feel more of Chen Tao's feelings for her, she chose to give up this gene function of being immune to cold and heat. Of course, she is still a fifth-generation gene body and will not die. But she can still feel cold and heat. Now she is cold. Chen Tao hugged her gently. There was a slight blush on Betty's face, she seemed to be more comfortable, and there was a smile on her face. Seeing Betty's dependence on him, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled. So cute. Sister, aren't you cold like this? Liz's voice came. Hearing the voice, Chen Tao raised his head and saw that Liz was standing beside him. She was wrapped in a thick animal skin, but her little face was still cute. She was looking at Betty with her big eyes. Betty was wearing too thin clothes, just a shirt and a mini skirt. In Liz's opinion, this was too little. Liz said, "It's very cold at night. Liz has clothes inside. Do you want them?" she asked innocently and cutely. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "No, I have some here too." As he said that, Chen Tao took out a white coat from somewhere in his hand and wrapped it around Betty. Lisa blinked her big eyes. She didn't see where Chen Tao put his hand just now. She thought Chen Tao took it out from somewhere and didn't care much. Lisa said, "If you feel cold, you can get closer to the campfire, so you won't be so cold." As she said that, Lisa pulled her fur coat. Betty put on the coat that Chen Tao gave her. She looked at Lisa and hummed softly, "I know." Lisa jumped away. Chen Tao looked at the campfire that was roasting wild wolves, and his eyebrows were slightly stretched. This civilized way of cooking looks quite rough. Dong dong dong. Suddenly, a sound of metal collision sounded, which was very pleasant. "The horse thieves are coming. The horse thieves are coming." Suddenly, a panicked voice sounded. For a while, the whole village was in chaos. Chen Tao's eyebrows were slightly stretched, and he slowly stood up. Ritat's face also changed. He stopped his movements and looked outside. He hurriedly looked at Chen Tao. Meeting Ritat's gaze, Chen Tao said, "What's going on?" Ritat's face was as pale as paper. "It's a horse thief, coming to rob." "Horse thieves, Ritate, we have to run." The woman's face was as pale as paper. She pulled Ritate's clothes in panic and said. Ritate looked at Chen Tao. He was a little hesitant, his eyes were full of questions. "Ritate," the woman panicked, "we have to take our daughter away, hurry up." Ritate looked at Chen Tao and said, "God." Chen Tao said, "Take me to see. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 412. Chen Tao followed Ritate to the source of the sound. This scene in front of him made Chen Tao frown. A group of men on horseback, wearing soft armor, rushed into the village. They rushed into the village with machetes in hand. The people in the village saw those people and ran in panic, trying to escape. But among them, a short-haired man rode past on a horse, swung the machete in his hand, and the man was cut into 2 pieces. Ha! Unlike the villagers' panicked expressions, the horse thieves had ferocious smiles on their faces. Seeing the villagers' bodies being cut into 2 pieces by themselves and blood flying, the horse thieves seemed extremely excited. "Dad," suddenly, a voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao looked forward. He found that the source of the voice was Liz. Liz's face was pale. When she saw Ritate here, her eyes lit up slightly, and she hurried over here. "Liz," Ritate's face turned pale. He never thought that Liz would come here to play. Liz ran over here, but she was too close to the rampaging horse thieves. Ritate couldn't think much and rushed over to save Liz. However, at this moment, a horse thief rode a horse and approached with a long knife. The horse thief had seen the situation on Liz's side. He grinned and raised the corners of his mouth. The speed of the horse must be faster than Ritate, and Liz was very close to him. The horse thief arrived first, turned the long knife in his hand, and slashed at Liz. Ritate's pupils condensed. Liz, he stretched out his hand to stop the horse thief's attack. But he was too far away from Liz. The smile on the horse thief's face was extremely ferocious, and he saw that the knife was about to hit Liz. Suddenly, a beautiful figure passed by. Bang! With a muffled sound, the horse thief's body fell off the horse. Liz threw herself into Ritate's arms. Ritate hugged Liz, with a hint of doubt in his eyes, and then looked over there. At first glance, the scene in front of him made Ritate's pupils condense slightly. I saw a small figure standing on the back of the horse. Although her body was petite, she was graceful. It was a girl, and the girl was Betty. But Betty at this moment made Ritate, a hunter, a little horrified. Because in Betty's little hand, there was a head, and that head was the head of the horse thief just now. Liz looked at Ritate, noticed Ritate's eyes, and said, "Dad, what's wrong?" She turned her face to look in the direction Ritate was looking. Ritate quickly blocked Liz's eyes with his hands and said, "It's okay, don't look." The scene in front of her was too bloody and not suitable for her. Betty stood on the horse's back and casually threw the head in her hand on the ground. She stretched out a pair of red flesh wings behind her, and she had a pair of crimson horns. She raised her hand, and a flaming longsword appeared in her hand. With a flap of her wings, she flew into the air. In the night, Betty was like a god descending from heaven, flying in the air, her eyes fixed on the horse thieves below. On the field, both the horse thieves and the villagers were attracted by the scene in front of them. "It's God. God has come to save us," the villagers reacted and knelt down in front of Betty. And the horse thieves looked at this side one by one, their expressions full of surprise and suspicion. Betty's eyes turned cold, and the red flesh wings behind her flapped, and her figure turned into a ball of fire and flew over. Ah! Accompanied by screams one after another. The horse thieves were burned to dust by the flames one by one. "Retreat!" one of the horse thieves shouted, and the other horse thieves immediately pulled the rope and pulled the horses to run. Betty frowned and said, "Now that you're here, don't go back." She flew over, slashing with the flaming sword in her hand. Betty is currently a fifth-generation genetic warrior, and these people in front of her are just ordinary people. Facing Betty's slaughter, they have no power to resist, and they are all burned to charcoal by Betty's flames. Betty's movements are very fast, in less than 3 minutes. All the horse thieves are dead. Betty returned to Chentao, put away her sword, wings, and horns, and landed beside Chentao. Chentao looked at Betty beside him. Betty stood there with her arms around her chest as if nothing had happened. Seeing this, Chentao smiled, raised his hand, stroked Betty's hair, and looked at Ritate. Ritate was covering Liz's eyes to prevent Liz from seeing these scenes. He looked at Chentao and Betty. "Dad, what's that smell? It smells like burning, so strange." "Can I let go?" Liz asked curiously. When Ritate heard it, he said, "I'll let go, and then you go home right away, don't look back." Well. Although Liz was a little confused, she still obeyed obediently. Ritate let go of his hand, and Liz could see it. She could see Chentao and Betty standing in front of her. Betty looked at Liz, she retracted her gaze and pulled the corner of Chentao's clothes. Chentao glanced at Betty, realized what Betty meant, he smiled, squatted down, and stretched out his hand. Chentao held Betty in his arms and let Betty sit in his arms. Betty held Chentao's clothes to prevent herself from falling. She shook her feet and looked at Ritate and said, "Is the wolf meat burnt?" Ritate was startled, and he hurriedly said, "It should be fine, it hasn't been long." Betty said, "Hurry up, I'm still hungry." "Okay," Ritate hurriedly responded, then took Liz's hand and walked towards home with Liz. As he walked, Chentao said, "What's the matter with those horse thieves?" Ritate said, "They are a group of barbarians who make a living by robbing." What they like to do most is to bloodbath the village, rob the food in the village, kill people, and even humiliate women. In this area, there are other villages besides our village. I heard that there are villages nearby that have been baptized by horse thieves. Ritat frowned and said, I have been worried about this. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. This makes it understand why Ritat was so vigilant after seeing him outside the village. Back to the door of Ritat's house. Chen Tao found a chair and sat down, letting Betty sit in his arms. Liz, Ritat's wife, was at the door. When she saw Ritat and Liz, her eyes lit up slightly. Ritat saw his wife coming over, stretched out his hand, hugged her in his arms, gently stroked his wife's hair, and said, It's okay. Chen Tao sat on the chair, he looked at Betty in his arms. He said gently, This time, why did you choose to take the initiative? You didn't seem to be so proactive before. In the past, Betty would have chosen to let it go when she saw these scenes. But now she took the initiative and saved Liz. Why? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 413. Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, I'm just hungry and want to eat early, so I just want to solve the problem as soon as possible. Chen Tao smiled. In fact, Betty did what she just did because she saw Liz was in danger. Although Liz only had a few words with her, Betty didn't want the person she had spoken to die like that. It's just that Betty doesn't want to admit it. Chen Tao looked ahead. Ritat's wife and daughter have already returned to the house, and Ritat continues to barbecue, acting seriously. It seems that it is not easy to live in the era of cold weapons. There are no rules in this world. Those robbers can do whatever they want. Killing people in the village and humiliating women are all casual things for them. Chen Tao looked at the bright moonlight in the sky. There are 2 moons in this world, and the night sky is beautiful, but in this civilization of the cold weapon age, war and death are the main theme here. Okay, a voice came from beside him. When Chen Tao came back to his senses, he saw Rita picking up 2 pieces of barbecue wrapped in animal skins and handing them to Chen Tao and Betty. Chen Tao took it, and Betty also took a piece. Chen Tao looked at the barbecue in his hand. He could smell the aroma of barbecue. Of course, it was much worse than the aroma of the carefully prepared steaks from Dixing. Chen Tao looked at Betty, who held the barbecue in her little hands and took a bite. She chewed lightly, her eyebrows quirking cutely. Looking at her expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, How does it taste? It's not delicious, the meat is too dry. Betty puffed her face and said, And it has no taste, so it's not delicious. Betty handed the barbecue to Chen Tao and said, I don't want it anymore, I'll give it to you. Upon hearing this, Chen Tao laughed. He raised his hand, scratched the bridge of Betty's nose, and said with a smile, You must be punished for wasting food like this. Betty's face turned red and she rolled her eyes at Chen Tao. Chen Tao approached Betty and kissed her thin lips. Parted lips. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he said with a smile, I feel uncomfortable eating roasted wolf meat, so let's go back and eat something else. When Betty heard this, her eyes glowed, and she glanced subconsciously at Liz, who was holding roasted wolf meat next to her and eating her mouth full of oil. Chen Tao noticed Betty's gaze. This scene is very interesting. In the past, if Chen Tao told Betty about eating steak, she would immediately say that she wanted to go. But this time, Betty did not call Chen Tao over immediately, but showed such an expression. Chen Tao looked at Liz. Liz looked here and said, Sister Betty, why don't you eat it? This is delicious. Betty blinked and looked at Liz's innocent expression. Betty pursed her thin lips, her eyes glowing, and she said, I don't like the food here very much, I prefer the food over there. Do you want to go to my place? Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty. Liz's eyes lit up slightly and she said, okay, if there is a chance, Liz would like to take a look. Hearing this, Betty said, you don't have to have a chance, you can go with me now. As she spoke, Betty raised her hand. A miniature wormhole appears in the air. See this thing? Liz was stunned. Right Hat on the side looked at the black hole, his pupils trembling slightly, and he walked over in a panic, protecting Liz behind him. Right Hat looked at Betty and Chen Tao and said, Dear God, please don't take Liz away. His face turned pale and he seemed a little scared. Betty was slightly startled, her eyebrows furrowed slightly, and then she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao could see that Right Hat was a little nervous. Abba, what are you doing? Liz was a little confused. Sister Betty, you just invited me to her house. Liz. Right Hat looked at Liz. He was a little nervous and looked at Chen Tao and Betty. God. Right Hat was very nervous. He had just seen Betty's bloody methods, and he had also seen the pair of fiery red wings and horns behind Betty. According to legend, Right Hat knew that gods are generally white in the Bible, and only the devil has blood-red wings. Although he saw that Betty had saved the village and Liz, Right Hat was still a little wary of Chen Tao and the others. He was a little worried that the two in front of him were not gods, but devils. I heard Betty wanted to take Liz away. Right Hat suddenly became nervous. Regardless of whether the two people in front of him were gods or devils, Right Hat was a little uneasy. He was worried that after Liz left, she would not come back. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled and said, I know your worries, don't worry, Betty is just an invitation. If Liz doesn't want to go, we won't force it. We won't do anything to embarrass others. Chen Tao put Betty down, stood up, and straightened out his clothes. Listening to Chen Tao's words, Right Hat was slightly startled. He looked at Chen Tao. He thought to himself, I must have thought wrong. The devil will tempt or force others, but only God will respect other people's opinions. Chen Tao said, that's it for today, let's go back first. With that said, Chen Tao stretched out his hand to Betty. Betty glanced at Liz. She looked away and placed her little hand on Chen Tao's palm. Chen Tao held Betty's hand and entered the wormhole. See the closed wormhole. Liz blinked her eyes and watched the wormhole disappear in front of her eyes. Liz looked at Ritat and said, Dad. Ritat stroked Liz's hair with his hand and said, it's okay, it's good like this. Although Liz was confused and didn't know what happened, she could only hum lightly when she heard Ritat say that, which was considered a response. At the same time, Chen Tao and Betty returned to the bedroom of base number 1. As soon as he arrived at the bedroom, Chen Tao found that although it was night on that planet, it was still daytime on Earth. The light outside the window was bright. Chen Tao looked at Betty beside him, who was looking at the scenery outside the window. From this angle, Chen Tao could see Betty's fair and delicate profile. His eyebrows slightly relaxed, he raised his hand, gently stroked Betty's shoulder, and said gently, if you can't let her go, let's go to play with her together next time. Betty was stunned, she looked at Chen Tao and said, can't let her go? What can't you let her go? Chen Tao blinked. Betty said, that little one? I just said it casually. I don't care whether she comes or not. I won't say anything more. I'm going to the restaurant to eat. Betty pulled her hand out of Chen Tao's palm and walked out of the bedroom. Looking at Betty's slender back, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed and he smiled. Betty is always arrogant. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 414. Betty sat at the dining table, arms around her chest, waiting for the steak to be served. She was staring at the wine glass in the middle of the table, in a daze. Thinking of the girl who was the same size as herself. Betty had a strange feeling in her heart. Although the girl only said a few words to Betty, it was too little for Betty. There were too few people who could say a few words to Betty. Especially a naive girl like Liz, with those innocent eyes, made Betty feel relaxed. When she thought of Liz's death, Betty felt a little uncomfortable. That kind of feeling is a feeling that a strong person sees a lovely thing and wants to protect it. Betty also knew that the civilization where Liz lived was very chaotic, and her village was rescued by horse thieves this time, but what about later? If horse thieves came later, could Liz still survive? It was very difficult. In the era of cold weapons, it was too easy to die. The survival rate of innocent little girls like Liz was extremely low. At this time, there was a noise next to her. Betty came back to her senses and found that the steak was served. The black pepper sauce was poured on the steak, accompanied by white mist, and the aroma came directly to her nose, very fragrant. Betty picked up the knife and fork, and while cutting the steak, she thought about Liz. Forget it, isn't she just a little girl in the cold weapon era? There are too many people like this who have died, so there is no need to care, Betty muttered. Chen Tao stood at the entrance of the restaurant. He looked at Betty sitting at the table and listened to Betty's self-talk. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He crossed his arms and looked at Betty. Betty is kind by nature, she is a very kind girl. However, Betty has always been a warrior. As a warrior, she only has enemies in her eyes. But during this period, after Chen Tao's training, Betty changed from a warrior to a pure little woman. In this way, some of her natures were directly intensified. It is her kind nature. She had taken the initiative to invite Liz here before, which was actually a way to protect Liz. But since Liz didn't come, Betty suppressed that emotion. Chen Tao retracted his gaze, went back to the bedroom, lay down, and looked at the ceiling. Closed his eyes. In the white thunder star, Laytat went into the mountains to hunt as usual. Today his luck was not so good, so he hunted a green rabbit. Unlike snow rabbits, green rabbits are white all over, with green tails, and are very small, only the size of a fist. It was a bit difficult for Laytat's family of 3 to eat. There was no other way, but it was dark, so Laytat could only tie up the green rabbit with a rope, hang it around his waist, and walk towards the village. It has been half a month since the last time he met the two gods. Until now, Laytat still can't forget that little Loli, who was less than 1 meter tall, slaughtered the group of horse thieves with a flaming sword. At the same time, Ritat did not forget that he asked Liz not to leave with the two men. Ritat did not know whether this decision was right or wrong. Ritat returned to the village. As soon as he arrived, he felt something was wrong. He entered the village and his face changed. This is... The whole village was in a mess, and the ground was full of corpses of villagers. Seeing this, Ritat's face turned pale. He could no longer care about anything else and hurried to his home. Michelle, Liz, Ritat ran to the door of his house in panic. At first glance, the scene in front of him made Ritat feel his blood boiling and rushing to his brain. In front of his house, there were 3 horse thieves. One of the horse thieves was pulling Michelle from the house to the door. As he pulled, he said, "If you resist again, I will kill you." The horse thief shouted coldly. Michelle's face was full of panicked tears. After hearing the horse thief's words and seeing the long knife covered with blood in his hand, she didn't dare to struggle too hard. The horse thief pulled Michelle out, then pushed Michelle to the ground, and stretched out his big hand to taint Michelle. "Asshole," Ritate shouted, holding a long sword in his hand, and rushed over directly. With a swing of the long sword, he slashed at the horse thief. Clang! With a crisp sound, Ritate's long sword was bounced away. Ritate was startled, and he looked at the person next to him. It was another horse thief, holding a long knife in his hand. He stared at Ritate, raised the corner of his mouth, and said, your woman. Retate. Save me. Save me. Michelle's face was as pale as paper, and she shouted for help to Retate in panic. When Retate heard it, his brain was congested, and he rushed over fiercely. The horse thief snorted, waved the long knife in his hand, and fought with Retate. The horse thief stared at Retate and smiled. What's the matter? Let us play for a while, and when we are happy, of course we will return it to you. Retate's face was pale. You bastard! I will kill you. Retate's brain was congested with blood, and the big knife in his hand slashed. Retate, save me. Michelle's voice sounded. Retate's brain was already congested with blood. Puff, a sound of flesh being cut off sounded. An arm holding a long sword fell to the ground. Retate took 2 steps back, covering his arm that was spurting blood with his hand. His face was as pale as paper, and he looked at the broken arm on the ground. Rightat is a hunter. He has always dealt with those wild beasts. He is obviously no match for the horse thieves who specialize in killing people and stealing goods. The horse thief showed a sneer. Abba, AMA, suddenly, a beautiful figure ran out of the house. It was Liz. When Liz saw this scene, her face turned as pale as paper, and her voice was heartbreaking. Seeing Liz, Michelle's already desperate eyes became even more desperate. Liz, why did you come out? Go back quickly. Michelle hid Liz, hoping that Liz could escape, but Michelle didn't expect that Liz actually ran out. Liz's face turned pale. Looking at the shocking scene in front of her, she felt her head turning white. Her father, Retate, had a broken arm, while her mother, Michelle, was pinned to the ground by her enemies and was about to be defiled. There was a shocking scene between these two, and Liz's face turned slightly pale. It's over, completely over. Rightat collapsed on the ground. At this time, the third horse thief held the slender wrist. He looked at Liz and said with a smile, you can actually hide such a delicate little hoof. I just like this. Come with me. As he spoke, he yanked his hand and pulled Liz away. Liz's face turned pale and she struggled hard. No, don't, save me. She looked at Retate and said, Father. Retate struggled to get up, picked up the sword, and rushed over again. A knife penetrated Retate's heart. Rightat was shocked, and the sword slowly fell to the ground. One by one, Rita looked at Liz being gradually pulled away. His pupils were dim. At this moment, he regretted it. Why not let Liz leave with those 2 people? Even if those 2 people are devils, Liz should be allowed to leave here. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 415. The horse thief pulled the long knife out of Retat's body. Retat's body lost support and fell to the ground, blood slowly flowing. He looked at his wife Michelle, and then looked at Liz who was pulled away. What was left in his pupils was only grey despair. The light in his eyes gradually dissipated. Dad, Liz screamed, and the unique lowly voice was full of strong fear. Her face turned pale, and she was also desperate. Come here. Suddenly, a force pulled, and Liz was thrown onto the dry grass. Liz looked at the ferocious man in front of her. Liz was frightened, her little face turned pale, and she didn't even have the consciousness to resist. The horse thief stretched out his hand and stretched it towards Liz. Liz's eyes trembled, and she looked at the hand that the horse thief slowly stretched out, and her eyes were full of despair. Seeing the hand getting closer and closer, Liz didn't move, and tears were spinning in her eyes. Don't touch her, suddenly, a voice sounded next to her. The horse thief was hit and fell down. Liz looked carefully and found that it was her mother, Michelle, who had just knocked the horse thief away. Michelle's clothes were messy, and she was panicked and uneasy. She hurriedly hugged Liz into her arms and said, Liz, are you okay? Her voice was trembling, and she hugged Liz tightly. Mom. Liz's eyes were full of tears, and she said, "Dad." Michelle closed her eyes, and tears also rolled in her eyes, saying, "Well, I saw it, I saw it." Humph. Suddenly, a big hand reached out, grabbed Michelle's hair, and pulled it out hard. Michelle was startled, and she raised her face in panic. Next to her was the horse thief who wanted to defile her just now. The horse thief had a gloomy face and was very unhappy. As a horse thief, he was actually broken free by a woman. This was a shame. "No, don't." Michelle's face was pale. Another horse thief grabbed Liz. The horse thief who grabbed Michelle pulled Michelle away directly, separated from Liz. Michelle fell to the ground, she screamed in pain. After all, the hair is connected to the scalp, and the horse thief's big hand grasped a bundle and pulled it out. The pain is not something a person can bear. Liz stretched out her hand and wanted to help Michelle. But a big hand grasped Liz's hand and pressed Liz's hand on the dry grass, and the other big hand directly slapped Liz's face. "Pa!" With a crisp sound, a bloody slap mark appeared on Liz's face. Liz's pupils trembled. The horse thief showed a cold look. "Lie down obediently for me, let me have fun," he said. When Michelle saw this, she panicked and said, Don't touch her, you can ask me to do anything. Don't touch her." "You," the horse thief who grabbed Michelle's hair laughed coldly. Puff. A long knife pierced Michelle's body, Michelle's pupils trembled slightly, and a mouthful of blood spurted out. Her pupils trembled as she looked at the blade piercing her heart. She slowly closed her eyes and fell to the ground without any movement. The horse thief put away his long knife, stared at Michelle's body lying on the ground, and said coldly, "I'm not interested in you now." Another horse thief who was holding Liz's hand saw this, and his mouth twitched. His eyes fell on Liz, and he smiled and said, "You have two good parents, which is really touching." Liz's pupils were full of tears. "Dad and Mom, woo woo woo." She cried loudly. The horse thief looked at the tears on Liz's little face, and he laughed. "It's really interesting, really exciting, so interesting. Then let me enjoy it now, and see how fun those two girls who protected with their lives make it." As he said, the horse thief's hand fell on Liz's clothes. "Dad and Mom." Liz muttered desperately. Now her consciousness was completely confused and she couldn't think of anything. The horse thief looked at this scene, and the corners of his mouth rose coldly. He was just about to enjoy the spoils in front of him. Suddenly, a silver light flashed by. The horse thief's head fell off his neck and rolled to the ground. The horse thief's body slowly fell to the ground. A beautiful figure appeared in front of Liz. Liz looked at the lowly with long fiery red hair in front of her, her eyes shining with a glimmer. "Betty." Betty stepped on the horse thief's body with her bare feet, looked at Liz, and said, "It's only been half a month since I last saw you, are you so embarrassed?" Liz's eyes were full of tears, and she slowly stood up. She cried and said, "Sister Betty, my parents are dead, they are dead." There were tears in her eyes that could not be held back and flowed down her cheeks. She wiped the tears on her face with her hands, sniffed, choked, and looked painful. Betty retracted her sight and looked behind her. When Betty rescued Liz just now, she had also solved the horse thief by the way. Now the ground is full of corpses. Except for Liz, no one is alive. Betty looked at it and saw Michelle lying in a pool of blood and Ritat, who had lost his life with a broken arm. Betty frowned slightly at this scene. Betty played with Chentao last night and got up this morning. Because she had nothing to do, she used the astronomical computer to check Liz. When she saw the scene of Liz being bullied, Betty wrapped her shirt and came over. But she was still too late. Liz's parents were already dead. Betty retracted her gaze, only to see Liz slowly fall down. Betty was startled. Liz. Liz was lying in the haystack, eyes closed, without any response. Betty jumped off the horse thief's body, came to Liz, squatted down, raised her little hand, and placed it in front of Liz's nose. She could feel the heat from Liz's breath, and felt Liz's breath. Betty breathed a sigh of relief. "It's good that you're not dead." Betty walked to Liz, raised her little hand, and held Liz horizontally. A black wormhole appeared in front of Betty. Betty took a step, stepped into the micro wormhole, and her figure disappeared on the spot. When she appeared again, Betty and Liz appeared in Chen Tao's bedroom. In the bedroom, Chen Tao was lying on the bed, eyes closed, sleeping. Seeing this, Betty's eyebrows slightly relaxed. She put Liz on the bed, then walked to Chen Tao, patted Chen Tao's face with her little hand, and said, "Tao." No movement. Betty frowned, pushed Chen Tao's body with her little hand, and said, "Get up, you bad guy." Betty shook him like this. Chen Tao couldn't sleep even if he wanted to. He simply stretched out his hand, held Betty's waist, and hugged Betty into his arms with force. Betty twisted in Chen Tao's arms. "Don't make trouble, something's wrong." Chen Tao slowly opened his eyes and looked at Betty in his arms. Betty's face was flushed. She was wearing a thin shirt, her fiery red hair was messy, and she looked a little lazy. It seemed that she had just woken up. Chen Tao smiled, stroked her soft hair, and said with a smile, "What's up so early in the morning?" Betty raised her delicate little face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Do you remember the girl named Liz we met before?" Chen Tao nodded slightly. Betty said, "Just now, horse thieves invaded her village again. The whole village was slaughtered, and only Liz was left. If I hadn't just gone there, she probably wouldn't have survived." Chen Tao frowned slightly. Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, "But she just fainted. How do you think this matter should be handled better?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 416. Chen Tao looked at the delicate and lovely face in front of him, his eyebrows slightly stretched. Chen Tao said, "Have you fainted? Where is she?" Betty looked at Chen Tao. "It's on the bed behind you." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled. He let go of Betty, stood up, and looked behind him. Sure enough, there was a little girl lying there. It was Liz. However, unlike the Liz that Chen Tao saw before, today's Liz was wearing an old top that had been washed white, but the top had been torn into tatters. Her hair was messy and her little lowly face was full of tears. Apparently she cried before going to bed. Looking at Liz's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. "Someone came close to me, it was Betty." Betty said softly, "How are you going to deal with it?" She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao raised his hand and touched the back of his head. Chen Tao is the king of the dragon people, and according to the rules of the dragon people civilization. The development of civilization, for example, human wars in a civilization, dragon people will not intervene. And the invasion of horse thieves only happened in a civilization. From a certain perspective, this kind of thing can also advance the process of civilization. This kind of thing should not be dealt with. And Betty took care of it. Frankly speaking, if Chen Tao didn't know about this matter, he wouldn't care about it. But now I know. It is completely inconsistent with Chen Tao's character to have Chen Tao throw Liz back to that civilization and let her destroy herself. But, how to deal with this matter? Betty slowly came over and snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. Sensing Betty's move, Chen Tao looked back at Betty. Betty was nestled in Chen Tao's arms, looking at Liz with her big eyes, and there was a hint of luster in her moving eyes. It seemed that Betty didn't want to give up on Beth. Looking at Betty's expression, Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, put his arm around her shoulders, and gently touched her arm. Betty raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "Let me talk to her first." Betty pursed her thin lips, looked at Chen Tao and said, "You can chat, but you are not allowed to mess around. She is a real Lolita." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but blinked his eyes, smiled bitterly and said, "I told you, I'm not a lolicon." "Who believes it?" Betty gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes. Chen Tao could only smile helplessly. Regardless, Chen Tao looked at Liz. Liz was still in a coma. Chen Tao read Liz's genetic code and wanted to find any abnormalities in Liz's body. However, after looking at it this way, Chen Tao found that there was nothing abnormal. Before contacting Betty, she said her parents were killed. Chen Tao guessed that she should have been in a sad transition, and her spirit was too stimulated, causing her to fall into a coma. The spirit cannot be seen through the genetic code, so Chen Tao cannot see it. However, through guessing, Chen Tao also knew what was going on. This matter is neither big nor small. We can only wake him up first and check the situation. Chen Tao raised his hand, touched Liz's cheek with his hand, and said, "Liz." When Betty saw Chen Tao's movements, she frowned her cute eyebrows, turned over, and moved her body next to Chen Tao and Liz. She said, "I'll call her, don't touch her." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao blinked and looked at Betty's cute little face, and he couldn't help but smile. Really, this girl is jealous too. Betty looked at Liz and raised her hand. Suddenly, time stops flowing. Liz's entire body turned into code blue, and everything around her changed color into code blue, except for Chen Tao and Betty. This is the inner world mode. It is not Chen Tao who turns on this mode, but Betty. Is Betty planning to use the other world mode to modify the code on Liz to wake her up? However, it seems that this is not possible. When Betty took a look, she frowned and then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, it was because she was too mentally stimulated that she fell into a coma. There is nothing wrong with her body. When Betty heard this, her eyebrows stretched slightly. Exiting the other world mode, Betty followed Chen Tao's example and touched Liz's face with her small hand and said, "Liz." Liz frowned, her eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes. There were still tears in her big eyes. She looked at Betty, "Sister Betty." When Betty heard this, she nodded slightly and said, "Are you okay?" Liz hummed. She slowly stood up and sat up. She seemed to remember something and suddenly looked at Betty and said, "Sister Betty, was I dreaming just now?" "My parents." Betty said, "It's not a dream, they are dead, both of them." She is very direct. This direct statement made Chen Tao's mouth twitch. Liz's pupils trembled slightly, and she looked away. "No, it's not true, it must be a dream, it must be a dream." Liz looked at Betty and said, "I want to see my parents, I want to see them." Betty frowned and said, "I didn't lie to you, it's true, they are all dead." "I don't believe it," Liz cried. Oh, I don't believe it, you must be lying to me." "I don't believe it, it's just a dream. My parents can't die. They are sure it's okay, I'm going to see them." Liz quickly got off the bed. She looked around and looked at the door in the distance. She trotted over, holding the door handle, trying to open it, but the door remained motionless. Liz bit her lip, looked at Betty, and said, "Sister Betty, let me out. I want to see my parents." Looking at Liz's eyes full of tears, she looked painful. Betty frowned, she stood up, and was about to speak. Suddenly, her shoulders felt slightly hot. Betty was slightly startled, she raised her face and looked at Chen Tao beside her. Chen Tao looked at Betty and said, "Let me do it." When Betty heard it, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Well." Chen Tao looked at Liz. Liz said, "Brother Chen Tao, can you let me go back?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Liz, he smiled and said, "Don't call me back so hard, don't worry, you are indeed dreaming, your parents are still alive, not dead." Betty was startled, she looked at Chen Tao. Liz was stunned for a moment, her eyes were shining, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Really?" Betty looked at Chen Tao. Liz's parents were obviously dead, what was Chen Tao trying to do? Could it be? Betty's eyes were shining. Chen Tao planned to reshape Liz's parents and revive them. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Of course it's true, I'm not lying. Take a look." As he said that, Chen Tao raised his hand. A picture appeared on the wall, and the picture showed a dark venue. In the venue, Ritat was lying on the ground with his eyes closed. Liz looked at the picture, her face was pale, and there were tears in her eyes, and the tears slowly flowed down her cheeks. "You lied to me, my father is dead, that's not a dream." Liz's voice was full of despair. Chen Tao said, "Really? Then take a closer look." Liz was stunned, she wiped away her tears and continued to watch. In the picture, Ritat's eyes moved and slowly opened. There was a trace of astonishment in his eyes. He looked at his hand, then struggled to get up from the pool of blood. He looked at his arm, but found that the arm that had just been broken had recovered. Ritat's face showed a trace of surprise and disbelief. Seeing this, Liz's eyes lit up, and she looked at Chen Tao in disbelief. Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Liz, and said with a smile, "I said, he is not dead, then he can't be dead. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 417. Lisa's eyes trembled slightly, and she looked at the picture again. In the picture, Ritat was covered in blood, but Ritat found that the blood was from the body lying next to him, not his. Ritat looked at his hand, and then looked around. "Strange, wasn't my hand cut off and my body pierced? What's going on?" Ritat looked at his heart. The clothes there did have traces of being cut by a knife, but Ritat found that the skin inside the crack was very healthy, without any scars. But Ritat clearly remembered that he was pierced by a knife barrel. Ritat suddenly, a voice sounded. Ritat was startled, he raised his head and saw Michelle running towards him with messy clothes, her eyes were full of surprise and surprise. After she ran over, she threw herself into Ritat's arms. Ritat was slightly startled, and gently hugged Michelle and stroked her hair. "Woo, I thought you were dead," Michelle choked and cried. Ritat stroked Michelle's hair, and there was a gleam in his eyes, which seemed not to be an illusion. He looked at the bodies lying on the ground, including the bodies of villagers and horse thieves. There was a strong smell of blood in the air. Just now, his arm was chopped off and his heart was pierced. These were not dreams. But why? Ritat looked at his hands and asked himself in his heart, "Why am I still alive?" Ritat looked at Michelle and said, "Did you see that I was pierced by a knife?" Michelle raised her face, wiped her tears, nodded repeatedly, and said, "I saw it, and I was killed too. I thought I was dead, but I just woke up and found that my wound was gone." "Is that so?" Ritat frowned. "What?" Michelle looked at Ritat. Ritat said, "We are very likely dead, but we were rescued, or, we were resurrected." "Resurrection?" Michelle was stunned and said, how is this possible?" Ritat nodded slightly and said, "For ordinary people like us, it is indeed impossible, but if it is God, it is different. I didn't tell you before that the two people we met a few days ago were gods." Michelle's pupils were trembling, "They are gods?" Ritat hummed, "Yes." Michelle looked up at the sky and said, "Thank God for saving us, thank God." Ritat nodded slightly and said, "Michelle, what about Liz?" Michelle was stunned and said, "I just looked for Liz, but I didn't find her." Her face turned slightly pale. "Could she be taken away by horse thieves?" Michelle looked nervous. Ritat's eyes shone with a gleam, and he said, I think it shouldn't be. Look, there are corpses of horse thieves next to them. These corpses of horse thieves are the ones we saw before. Michelle was startled. She looked around and saw the corpses of the horse thieves on the ground. Michelle was very impressed with these horse thieves. Seeing these horse thieves, she subconsciously moved closer to Ritat. What's going on? The horse thieves are all dead, so where did Liz go? Michelle looked at Ritat. Ritat said, I think she should have been taken away by God. God. Michelle looked at Ritat, and there was a light in her eyes. Did God take a fancy to our daughter? Ritat put his arm around her shoulders and said, this is the only possibility. Didn't God want our daughter to go with them before? Michelle looked at the corpses lying on the ground, and then said, if this is true, then we should be happy for Liz. Ritat looked at the corpses lying on the ground next to him, and he nodded slightly, yes. In the bedroom on the other side. Liz could only see the picture but could not hear the sound. But looking at the picture in front of her, Liz was sure that Chen Tao did not lie to her. She looked at Chen Tao and said, why can't I hear any sound? Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Liz, and said with a smile, it shouldn't be necessary. I want you to know that they are still alive, that should be enough. Liz pursed her lips and looked at Chen Tao, I want to see them, brother Chen Tao, let me go back and let me see them, okay. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Liz and said, Liz, do you want to protect your parents? Liz was startled, she nodded slightly, yes, I do. Chen Tao smiled, looked at Liz and said, if you want, you can stay with me and let your sister Betty teach you how to deal with bad guys. When you go back, you can stand up and protect your parents in things like today. Liz's eyes lit up slightly, she looked at Betty and said, Sister Betty, will you teach me how to deal with bad guys? Betty was slightly startled, her eyebrows stretched slightly, and then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, if you are interested, teach her. Now that we have saved her, if we don't help her and let her go back, I think we will have to do it in a while. Betty retracted her gaze and looked at Liz. She pouted, crossed her arms and said, I am too lazy to do this kind of thing. Let me teach me, I can't do it. Betty lay on the bed, looking at the ceiling, looking unwilling to care. Looking at Betty's actions, Chen Tao touched the back of his head. He looked at Liz, who was a little depressed, and said with a smile, then, let me teach you. When Liz heard this, her eyes lit up slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, thank you, brother Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled. What? Betty suddenly stood up and looked at Chen Tao, you want to teach? Chen Tao looked at Betty and said, yeah. Betty puffed up her cheeks and said, don't even think about it. She hurriedly got off the bed, walked to Liz, and said, Liz, I'll teach you. You have to stay away from Chen Tao, he is not a good person. Chen Tao was stunned. What he did was good enough, how could he become a bad person? Betty didn't dare to think what Chen Tao was thinking. She held Liz's hand and said, come on, I'll take you to my room. I'll change your clothes and see how torn they are. After changing, I'll teach you. Yeah. Liz nodded obediently. She subconsciously looked at Chen Tao, with doubts in her big eyes. Facing Liz's side, Chen Tao could only smile back, wanting to make Liz feel more at ease. Betty held Liz's hand and left the bedroom together. Looking at the door slowly closing. Chen Tao breathed a sigh of relief, lying on the bed by himself, looking at the ceiling. Thinking about what had just happened, he smiled. It turns out that Betty also has such a kind and lovely thing. It feels quite interesting to see the other side of Betty. If Betty can stop thinking of herself as a Lolita Control, it would be better. It's a pity that this title of Lolita Control is probably not going to be taken off in this life. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 418. Fang Shueqing had just gotten up. She was sitting in front of the dressing table, holding a comb and combing her long snow-white hair. Looking at herself in the mirror, Fang Shueqing's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. Fang Shueqing in the mirror was wearing a strapless white gauze dress that fit Fang Shueqing's proud figure. The shoulders are thin, the waist is held tightly, and the thin fabric is held up high on the upper body. Her skin is like gelatin, and her temperament is charming. With her snow-white and smooth long hair hanging naturally on her shoulders, and her charming temperament paired with her stunning face, she can be considered a great beauty. The fluffy ears on her head and the fluffy foxtail not only did not reduce her charm, but also added a bit of exotic style to her. Fang Shueqing in the mirror is full of energy. Thinking about what happened during this period, Fang Shueqing always had a smile on her face. During this time, Chen Tao often came to play with her. Even if Chen Tao is not around, Fang Shueqing still has other sisters to play with her. Life now is much better than Fang Shueqing's life before. In the past, Fang Shueqing was completely alone. If she was needed, it was just because of his appearance that he wanted to occupy her and keep her as a pet. At that time when she lived before, those people did not regard her as a human being at all. But things are different now. Fang Shueqing has many more sisters around her, and there is also a man who dotes on her. Thinking of that man, Fang Shueqing could feel her heart warm. When she thought of being hugged by that man, Fang Shueqing's eyes glowed with a glint. Dong dong, a voice sounded at the door. Hearing this voice, Fang Shueqing turned her face and looked at the door. "Shueqing, it's me, are you up?" came the voice. Fang Shueqing recognized the owner of the voice. She smiled and said, "Come in, the door is unlocked." The door was opened. A beautiful figure walked in from outside the door. The person who came was tall, delicate, and beautiful, with long golden hair and a beautiful face. She had a faint smile on her face, and she was full of confidence. The person who came was none other than Long Renlin. Lin walked over, naturally stretched out her hand to take the comb from Fang Shueqing's hand, then stood behind Fang Shueqing, picked up the long snow-white hair with her bare hands, and gently combed it with the comb. Fang Shueqing stood upright, and Lin in the mirror said with a smile, "Has your husband been looking for you again?" In the past, Fang Shueqing almost died at the hands of a dragon. She didn't have a good impression of the dragon at first, and she didn't have much favorable impressions of Lin as a dragon either. But as they got along with each other during this period, the sisterly relationship between Fang Shueqing and Lin became much better. In the past 6 months, whenever Chen Tao bullied Lin and Lin couldn't bear it, she would always come to Fang Shueqing for help. Over time, the relationship between Fang Shueqing and Lin's sisters has improved a lot. Lin smiled and said, "No, I'm just bored and came to your place to take a look." "What beautiful hair, snow white, smooth, and healthy," Lin said in admiration. Fang Shueqing's eyes were glowing and her face turned slightly red. She said, "Your hair is also very beautiful." Lin smiled. She suddenly approached Fang Shueqing, put her arms around Fang Shueqing's shoulders, and leaned her face against Fang Shueqing's. She looked at Fang Shueqing in the mirror and said with a smile, "Your skin and figure are beautiful and good looking. No wonder every time Chen Tao when I see you, I want to carry you to the bedroom." Fang Shueqing's face turned slightly red and she didn't say anything. She just looked at Lin with her big moving eyes. Lin said with a smile, "During this period, I want to leave here and go to Dragon City to raise my children. Then, I will leave him to you to deal with." Fang Shueqing blushed even more. She looked at Lin in the mirror and said, "Why do you want to go to Dragon City? Isn't it good to raise children at home?" Lin hugged Fang Shueqing's slender figure tightly and said with a smile, "Of course it's not good. If I stay at home, that bad guy will definitely not let me go. As for Dragon City, his children, and I, this matter is very important as it relates to the gender balance in Dragon City, And, that is my first child, and I don't want anything to happen to my child. So, during this period, it's up to you to deal with him, Lin said with a smile. Fang Xueqing's face turned red, and she felt her cheeks getting hot. She hummed and said, I will do it. Lin put her hand on Fang Xueqing's lower abdomen. She looked at Fang Xueqing in the mirror. She smiled and said, I think you will be almost ready when you come back. Fang Xueqing's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She looked at her belly in the mirror. Her eyes glowed with a trace of luster. She said, will I have it too? May I? Although Fang Xueqing has always regarded herself as a human being, she also knows that she is special, with a tail and ears. She had always doubted whether she could be pregnant with Chen Tao's child. Seeing Lin and Betty being pregnant, she was also a little envious. But she didn't think much about it. It didn't matter that Chen Tao loved her. But if she could really have a child, she would be even happier. Lin said with a smile, of course. He said that in fact, the ghost is also a genetic body. In essence, it is actually a human being. If I can get pregnant, of course you can too. Fang Xueqing's eyes lit up slightly. Lin let go of Fang Xueqing and said with a smile, then I'll leave him to you. I'll leave first. When Fang Xueqing heard this, she said, yes. Lin put the comb down and walked away. Fang Xueqing looked at herself in the mirror. She stood up slightly, combed her hair, and walked to the closet. On the other side, Chen Tao had just finished his shower and was sitting on the sofa in his bathrobe, looking at the scene in front of him. Through the screen, you can see that in Betty's bedroom, Betty is teaching Liz how to use the gene function. It seems that Betty has evolved the gene for Liz. Chen Tao took the wine glass and drank it by himself. Crack. The door was opened. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he looked at the door. A beautiful figure walked in from outside the door. Seeing the beautiful figure in front of him, Chen Tao's eyes lit up slightly. It was Fang Xueqing who came in. Fang Xueqing was wearing a thin white gauze skirt and stood at the door. The skirt of the gauze skirt was very short, and her legs were slender and straight. She was tall and her bust was slightly supported. Looking at Fang Xueqing's charming figure, Chen Tao smiled, patted the seat beside him, and said with a smile, come. Fang Xueqing's delicate face smiled when she heard it. She listened to Chen Tao's words and walked to Chen Tao and sat down. Chen Tao stretched out his hand and hugged Fang Xueqing's waist. Fang Xueqing snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smelled the unique fragrance of Fang Xueqing and felt her body temperature. Chen Tao looked at Fang Xueqing. Fang Xueqing's little head was nestled in Chen Tao's arms, her face was flushed, charming and moving. Chen Tao raised his hand, pinched her chin, and turned her face around. The four eyes met. Chen Tao looked at her delicate face, narrow and long eyelashes, high nose bridge and delicate thin lips. The more Chen Tao looked at her, the more he liked her. He kissed her. The lips parted. Chen Tao held her horizontally in his arms and walked to the bed. Fang Xueqing's face turned even redder. She hid her face in Chen Tao's arms and closed her eyes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 419. 3 hours later. Chen Tao gently hugged the girl in his arms and looked at Fang Xueqing. Fang Xueqing closed her eyes and lay in Chen Tao's arms with her eyes closed. Chen Tao smiled, gently touched Xueqing's shoulder below, and said with a smile, before, I took the initiative to find you, why did you take the initiative to come to me today? Upon hearing this, Fang Xueqing moved closer to Chen Tao's arms, blushing and said, I miss you. Chen Tao smiled, approached Fang Xueqing, and slowly kissed Xueqing's forehead. He felt her body temperature, smelled her fragrance, and hugged her tenderly. Fang Shueqing snuggled into Chen Tao's arms obediently, and she said softly, "Lin just came to see me." Chen Tao hummed, and looked at Fang Shueqing, admiring Fang Shueqing's beauty. He held Fang Shueqing's little hand, put her little hand in his and played with it. Fang Shueqing's hands are extremely slender and her fingers are small, making her look very cute. The skin of her little hands was as white as cream, as if it were made of white jade, but it was very soft as boneless. "And it's warm." Chen Tao said, "Lin comes to see you, what happens next?" He looked at Fang Shueqing. Fang Shueqing's tail swayed slightly behind her. She looked at the little hand held by Chen Tao and said, "Lin said she was going to Dragon City to raise a child." Raising children, Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Fang Shueqing hummed. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "That's it?" Lin said that she was pregnant and had a child. She was afraid that you would go too far and hurt the child, so she went to Dragon City to raise the child. I guess it was I want to come back after giving birth. Chen Tao blinked and smiled bitterly, "How could I hurt the child?" Fang Shueqing showed a playful smile. She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "That's not necessarily true. Look at you, Lin was bullied by you and asked me for help." Chen Tao blinked and smiled bitterly, "The past was the past, and the present is the present." Chen Tao gently hugged Fang Shueqing and said, "I am sensible." "Well, people know." Fang Shueqing leaned her little head in Chen Tao's arms, "It's just that Lin said she was worried about what might happen." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Well, Na Lin is not here, that means her obligation." He held Fang Shueqing's chin with his hand, raised her face, looked at Fang Shueqing's face, looked at Fang Shueqing, and said with a smile, "Are you responsible for everything? One person bears the responsibility of two people." Fang Shueqing's face was filled with dizziness. She looked at Chen Tao and hummed softly, "Lin also asked me to do this." Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled, "Your share of obligations has been used up just now, and Lin's share will be next." Fang Shueqing's face turned red, she struggled a little, and then hid her little head in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao gently held Fang Shueqing's waist, leaned close to Fang Shueqing, and said softly, "Lin is afraid of anything unexpected, but you don't have to be afraid. I think I shouldn't care so much about propriety with you, right?" Hearing this, Fang Shueqing's face turned red and she closed her eyes and dared not speak. Chen Tao approached Fang Shueqing and kissed her. Time passed by minute by minute. 2 hours later. Chen Tao was wearing a bathrobe and sitting on the bedside, holding a wine glass and looking at the red liquid in the glass. At this time, Chen Tao heard footsteps. He raised his face and looked in the direction of the bathroom. Fang Shueqing walked out of the bathroom and looked at Chen Tao. Looking at Fang Shueqing in front of him, Chen Tao's eyes lit up slightly. Fang Shueqing was wearing a thin shirt. The white shirt outlined Fang Shueqing's proud figure. Her waist was full and the shirt around her waist was held up high. The shirt is very short, and the legs are long and straight. Her skin was as white as gelatin, and she was so beautiful. Chen Tao smiled and patted the place next to him. Fang Shueqing blushed, slowly walked over, sat next to Fang Shueqing, and then snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smelled the fragrance of Fang Shueqing's hair and said, "How good are you? Come with me to the underground for a walk today." When Fang Shueqing heard this, she looked at Chen Tao and hummed softly. Chen Tao smiled. He raised his hand and stroked her hair. An hour later. In their district. Chen Tao and Fang Shueqing appeared together in the park in Tal district. Inside Qingyuan Park. Chen Tao and Fang Shueqing were walking in the park. Chen Tao has the lake on his left and the woods on his right. Walking beside Chen Tao was Fang Shueqing. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Fang Shueqing wore a thin white shirt with an ultra-short plaid skirt, and a pair of white stockings wrapping her slender and straight legs. Wearing a pair of black high-heeled boots. Her long hair was tied up in a single ponytail and hung naturally behind her back. She had a pair of fluffy fox ears on both sides of her head and a fluffy tail behind her. Far from destroying her beauty, these ears and tail add an exotic look to her. Chen Tao stretched out his hand and hugged her waist. Feel Chen Tao's movements. Fang Shueqing was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled. Fang Shueqing blushed, looked away, and walked with Chen Tao in the park. There were many people in the park, both men and women, and they all stared at Fang Shueqing as they passed by. Whether it's Fang Shueqing's figure or charming temperament, she is the center of attention wherever she goes. What's more, Fang Shueqing's ears and tail attracted people's attention. Look at that woman. That figure, my God, it's too beautiful. Those ears and tail, is that Cos? Who is she causing? No matter who Cos, she is so beautiful. Discussions from the side rang out. Hearing those discussions, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he smiled. At this time, a man with dyed yellow hair sat on a chair next to him, crossing his legs and looking at the sky boredly. So boring, the man whispered, saying, "Is there nothing to do? Have you heard?" Two girls passed by the man. The man squinted his eyes and stared at the two girls. "What did you hear?" The tall girl looked at the petite girl next to her in confusion. The petite girl said softly, "It happened the day before yesterday. In Qingyun Park, isn't there a Changjiun well in Qingyun Park, an ancient well?" "Changjiun well," the tall girl said, "I saw it on the road sign. Didn't we just pass by? The well is sealed." The petite girl nodded slightly, and said, "Well, the day before yesterday, people found a body in the well, so it was sealed." "Body?" The tall girl looked at the petite girl. The petite girl nodded slightly and said, "The body in the well is a girl's." Then after the inspection organized by Hong Tao, it was found that the girl was thrown into the well by someone, that person, and it seems that she was thrown in the well the night before yesterday, the petite girl said. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 420. The tall girl turned pale, and she said, "Is it so scary? Then let's not stay here, let's go back first." When the petite girl heard this, she smiled and said, "Don't worry, the current Tal district is not the same as before. It is under the control of the Hongtao organization. In broad daylight, I believe that even if that person is there, he dare not do anything." The yellow-haired man next to him curled his lips, slowly stood up, stared at the backs of the two girls, and followed them. He muttered, "Do you think I dare not do anything? Then I will show you." He put his hands in his trouser pockets, squinted his eyes, stared at the backs of the two girls in front of him, and his mouth corners were coldly raised. Looking at the two girls is like looking at a pair of prey. The yellow-haired man licked the corners of his mouth. At this moment, the yellow-haired man noticed that someone was passing by, and his side turned, his eyes fixed on that side. Next to him, a man and a woman passed by him. The man looked average, so the yellow-haired man didn't think much about it, but the woman, wearing a shirt with a short skirt and white stockings, had a perfect and proud figure, and her skin was as white as cream. A head of healthy snow-white long hair naturally draped behind her. A pair of snow-white fox ears and a fluffy white tail made her look even more exotic. Looking at this beautiful and moving person, the yellow-haired man's eyes were fixed. This figure, these legs. The yellow-haired man licked his tongue, and his mouth corners slightly raised. He stepped to catch up with Chen Tao and Fang Shueqing. The yellow-haired man stared at Fang Shueqing's back, and he looked at Fang Shueqing's moving back. Looking at Fang Shueqing's slender waist, thin shoulders, and the pair of slender white legs under the skirt, the yellow-haired man licked his mouth corners. Chen Tao hugged Fang Shueqing's waist and walked to the top of the park. It was evening now, and the top of the mountain was relatively remote, so there were not many people. As we got closer to the top of the mountain, there were fewer people. When we reached the top of the mountain, there were only Chen Tao and Fang Shueqing around. On the top of the mountain, there was an open space painted with cement. It was surrounded by railings in a circle, and there were benches next to the railings for tourists. In the middle of the open space, there was a fountain, and in the middle of the fountain was a golden tripod. Chen Tao took Fang Shueqing to sit on a bench. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Fang Shueqing nestled in Chen Tao's arms like a kitten. Watching Fang Shueqing's actions, Chen Tao raised his hand and slowly and gently stroked her shoulders. With the beauty in his arms, Chen Tao could smell her faint fragrance and feel her body temperature. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Fang Shueqing was wearing a white shirt, her waist was slender, and her upper body was propped up high. The arc was very proud. Looking down, the skirt is very short, and her legs are wrapped in white stockings, slender and straight. Her fair skin is like cream, beautiful and moving. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Fang Shueqing's face. She had a pair of big eyes under her narrow eyelashes, and a thin mouth under her high nose bridge. Chen Tao pinched Fang Shueqing's chin, turned her little face over, and kissed her. After the kiss, Fang Shueqing's face flushed, and she slowly hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. Someone is here. Fang Shueqing's fluffy white ears slowly drooped. So cute. Is there someone? Chen Tao subconsciously looked forward. Sure enough, there was someone. On the bench opposite, a yellow-haired man sat on it, crossed his legs, and stared at this side, to be precise, staring at Fang Shueqing next to Chen Tao. He crossed his arms, and his eyes looked like he was going to get close to the flesh. When the yellow-haired man saw Chen Tao coming, he turned his head and looked at the scenery beside him, as if there was no such place. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Chen Tao looked at the sky. It was already evening time. In this evening time, there are still people staying on the top of Qingyun Mountain to enjoy the scenery, and they are alone? Is this yellow-haired man really here to enjoy the scenery? Chen Tao took back the time and looked at Fang Shueqing beside him. Fang Shueqing was like a kitten, nestling in Chen Tao's arms, with the corners of her mouth slightly raised, looking very well behaved. Looking at Fang Shueqing's expression, Chen Tao smiled, and he gently said in Fang Shueqing's ear, "Let's go for a walk in the grove." Grove. Fang Shueqing's face blushed slightly. It's evening now, and the sky is dark. Wouldn't it be darker if we go into the grove? In the grove, it is estimated that no one can see. Then what does Chen Tao want to do with her in the grove? It must be to do something that is not suitable for people to see. Thinking of those things, Fang Shueqing's face flushed, but she did not resist and gently hummed in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao stood up. He put his arm around Fang Shueqing's waist and accompanied Fang Shueqing to leave the open space and go into the grove next to it. When they first entered the grove, it was still a little bright, but it gradually became darker when they entered the grove. The surroundings also became quiet. Chen Tao could hear the chirping of crickets and various insects, as well as the chirping of birds in the trees. The sound of the dead leaves breaking on the ground was particularly pleasant when he stepped on them. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Fang Shueqing's moving figure beside him, and he stretched out his hand and exerted force. Fang Shueqing exclaimed softly and leaned against the trunk of a tree. Chen Tao approached Fang Shueqing's face and looked into her eyes. Fang Shueqing looked at Chen Tao, who was so close to her, and her face flushed. Chen Tao held Fang Shueqing's chin with his hand, lifted her face, slowly approached her, and then kissed her lips. Lips parted. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing, and he saw her eyes were misty. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing's expression and said with a smile, "So soon, you are moved. It's your first time outside, are you very excited?" Fang Shueqing's face was red, her eyes trembled slightly, and she dared not speak. And just at this moment. Haha, it's really interesting, a couple, in the evening, ran to the grove to play this kind of game. Since you want to play, why not add me? An inappropriate voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he subconsciously turned his head to look. I found that the yellow-haired man was standing next to me, with a playful sneer on his lips. Looking at the yellow-haired man, Chen Tao frowned slightly and said, "Playing games? Sorry, I don't plan to let you participate in this game." The yellow-haired man raised his mouth slightly and said, "You don't want me to participate? Really? What if I must participate?" Hearing this, Chen Tao frowned, "You are very brave, what if I don't?" The yellow-haired man raised his hand, took out a black pistol, pointed the gun at Chen Tao, and said, "No? Then you will die."